probably should be no one at this point, but I'll go ahead and reintroduce myself. My name is Alec. I'm the foreigner.
Yeah.
Get out of the country,
right? Yeah, is it that obvious? All right, cool. So yeah, out from California. This guy's really responsible for getting me out here. Again, thanks for picking me up at the airport. That coffee was what I really needed then. So yeah, based on the theme of what we're talking about all weekend in terms of ritualized discomfort, I figured I might as well share some thoughts that I have about suffering in general, how to do it well, and how to get meaning out of it, right? Because there's this quote from a Zen Buddhist monk called Thich Nhat Hanh. We'll hope I'm saying that one right. But his idea is that when you learn how to suffer, you suffer less, right? So I'll say that again. When you learn how to suffer, you actually suffer less, right? And that comes from a pretty big idea in Buddhist philosophy in general. If you look at like their core, they call them the noble truths, the four noble truths of Buddhism. This is like the foundation of what their belief system is. It's all about, basically number one is pain and suffering is inherent to life, right? Like that is just a feature of this existence and reality that we live in.
No, it's a bug.
It's a bug. Exactly. So that's basically the first thing that you kind of got to get over as a Buddhist is like, oh, life is pain. Cool, wonderful. Second one is understanding like that pain comes from attachment and desire. And so it's understanding now like where all that comes from. The third part of it is that detachment from said desire or attachments will mitigate or alleviate or relieve you from that suffering. Like that's your kind of your way out. And then the fourth noble truth is like, hey, this eightfold system or like eightfold path of Buddhism is the way to actually do all that. So it's kind of like a system of like accepting what reality is, where it comes from, how we're gonna deal with it, and here's a specific path to do it, right? So that's just kind of like a crash course on Buddhist philosophy. There you go.
Shout out.
So that's kind of the idea that we're going through, making sure this is up and running. So before we kind of get into it, just kind of want to ask you guys, because I don't want this to be just a strict talk or speech, right? I want it to be kind of an engaging discussion. Since we don't have like a million people there, it's actually pretty doable. And I want you guys to also help kind of contribute to this discussion as well. So before we start, I want to kind of ask if anyone has like, well, let's just start here. Has anyone like ever suffered?
Suffered in general.
Suffered in general, yeah. Has everyone experienced pain? Right? Cool. Does anyone want to share like one of those particular moments? This could be physical suffering, could be mental, emotional, all of the above. Anyone got something they want to share?
I'm actually going through something like that now.
Mm-hmm.
For those who haven't heard, I've recently employed like my first employee.
Oh, congrats.
I've been at the whole architecture business for like a couple of years now. I think it's like 4. Working for myself, that is. And like I'm no stranger to suffering. But literally last night I only went to sleep at 2 o'clock something. And that is just the kind of like the stress that comes with it, because now I've got this guy to train and you know deadlines to meet, and I'm still technically the professional who actually has to look over everything. So it's not really a emotional suffering at the end of the day. It's more a, how would you want to say, like a exhausted kind of suffering. And where my brain just starts bouncing all around. And that kind of becomes uncontrollable until the point where like my head literally feels on fire, you know?
Absolutely.
Not the first time. I wouldn't say I know how to deal with it, so don't ask me questions.
Well, that's why we're here.
I just take it like a man.
That's something like bearing the responsibility, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of all you can do.
Your employee gets paid at the end of the month no matter what. Like you as the owner, on the other hand, it's like
you take the risk.
You take the risk.
You take the risk. If somebody's not getting paid, it's I.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm doing it willingly though, so it's fine.
Thank you.
Nice. Thanks for sharing.
Up as much as we can.
We should clap.
No, that's actually pretty common. Well, maybe not your situation is common necessarily, but the kind of feeling of like overwhelm and exhaustion and kind of the mental pressure to perform that kind of keeps wearing on you. That's a very, very like commonly large source of suffering, I'd say, right? So that's kind of that's a very like good kind of example, and I think some of the stuff we're going to talk about today could actually really help out for framing that. Does anyone else have any kind of additional thoughts?
This is extremely random, but there was with one of our go-kart races, I was sick as fuck. Like I just wasn't feeling it. I didn't want to pitch. I didn't want to be there. I was just sick. And I got there and started doing the race, and the first few laps was just slow. It was weak. It just wasn't happening. But then I just got to myself. I'm like, listen, you are here now. You're busy racing. Might as well just forget about everything else and just focus on the race. Forget about the sick. Forget about the cough. Forget about everything. Just go for it.
Love that.
And I set the best time that day. It's like, out of like, yeah, this goes this. And that it's a ridiculous part of, I'm not looking down on suffering at all, but there is like a mental shift you can do, and just like, you're already here, you might as well try to make the best of it. Don't give up, don't drag along and just finish a few laps.
100%.
At least try.
Shoulder down,
And
head up.
somehow it
100%.
worked. Somehow,
Somehow it worked out.
Please,
Right.
It's not necessarily about distracting yourself from that pain that you're going through. It's almost like accepting it, right, for what it is,
it's not going away.
and making the best
So,
of it anyways.
100%.
Yeah.
Very good point.
I feel like that also applies to my running, which is more like a physical account of suffering. But it's exactly to what you're saying, where it's the pain doesn't go away. You just got to get better at like sitting with it, like keeping that pace, and like it's fine. It is what it is, and like sit in that pocket of pain. And especially when you're training at like hard levels, your body the next morning, like you're not really in optimal condition. It hurts, you know, your feet hurt, your knees hurt, whatever. But again, it's accepting the suffering and sort of just going through it. That again, you suffer less in a way, because like you were saying earlier,
Just
you don't
embracing.
suffer, yeah.
Just embracing.
That's a
Yeah,
pattern
yeah.
that I see a lot, because kind of touching back on like when people hear about like what Buddhism is and what they're all about, right? They kind of get the conclusion like, oh, life is pain, cool, and it's like, I'm out, you know, like because they don't really want that. They don't want to pursue the pain. They think it's like bad, because it's this idea that like happiness is avoidance of pain. Like happiness is the diminishing of pain, and any like level of pain diminishes your happiness. But the reality is that the happiness really comes from the mastery over pain. Pain is pain, right? It's a pretty like simple, whatever you guys think of pain in your mind, that's like what I would think of pain, right? It's just something that happens, a situation that causes distress or pain, right? Suffering is your choice. Suffering is the pain multiplied by your resistance or avoidance to it, right? Your resistance to pain is in your control, right? So this is why we say when you learn how to suffer, you suffer less, because you're diminishing the resistance factor of that pain, right? And so I've got a quick little story that will kind of here we go. That will kind of illustrate what we're talking about, right? So some of you guys have probably heard this story before, especially if you guys listen to my podcast. This guy, right?
Gotcha.
My #1 fan over here. Thank you. So, has anyone heard the story of like the cattle and the buffalo?
Oh, with the storm.
With the storm. All right,
Yeah.
he's
No,
clued
I've
in as
heard
well,
it.
right? Cool.
Tell me.
So,
Tell me, boss. Tell me.
We know the punchline already.
that's the long. I know, right? It's like, don't spoil it, guys. Calm down. I have to make sure we're like on the right. There we go. Fire. Okay, cool. So, the cattle and the buffalo both experience the same thing, right? Like, let's say there's a big storm coming in, right? So we've got ourselves like very like angry little motherfucking storm cloud, right? He's not out to help, right?
He does look.
He does look pretty angry, right?
Nailed it.
But he's happy about it, right? So the storm cloud's coming in. A cattle, let's see if I can draw a little cattle here. Quick draw. we'll see how this goes. So the cattle, in response to the storm, will almost always run away in response to it, right? We'll put some spots so it's like a nice little American cow. We can add some little horns to it as well.
Ours
There we
got
go.
spots too.
No, only ours have spots. So the cattle, in response to the storm, will run away from it. They're trying to get out of it. They sense the storm coming before it even arrives. They're off the other way, right? And what this ends up doing, they're not faster than the storm. The storm comes anyway, and now they're stuck in the storm, but they're still trying to run away. So as the storm's moving this way, so are the cattle. So they end up sitting in the storm
Longer than they
for
would.
longer
Yeah.
than if they just stood still, right? So sometimes they're in the storm for days on end, right? So contrast that with buffalo. We're going to try to
Bigger horns.
Technology.
bigger horns. I'm going to try to morph this into a buffalo out here, guys. There we go. Looks like a little buffalo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got
we go.
muscles, yeah.
Red Bull
Close my
buffalo.
eyes.
The buffalo, on the other hand, when they see a storm coming, before it even gets there, they run into the storm. They attack it head on. They go right into it, right? So this does a couple things. They're in the storm a lot less time. Even if they were to stand still, since the storm's going this way, the buffalo are going that way, they're actually minimizing the time they spend in the storm, right? And then they also minimize the total suffering even before they hit the storm, because like these cattle, like they're worrying about it, they're running, they're exhausting themselves before they even get the stimulus of the storm. They're suffering for a lot longer before they even get in the storm and while they're in the storm.
Before
Right.
the problem.
Yeah. So by embracing the pain, that's kind of what the storm would represent. It's always there. In both of these situations, the pain is the same. The capacity of the storm to inflict damage or pain or suffering or whatever is there, right? But it depends on the response of the buffalo versus the cattle that determines their level of suffering, right? All by their level of resistance to it, right?
Sorry. I
Go
don't know
ahead.
if this may help anyone else who thinks like me in that regard. I've always struggled with the term embrace the pain.
Mm.
You know, embrace to me is a positive thing. And to look at pain positively and be like, ah, it's here is always, I think another word for that is understand the pain.
Mm.
You know, like the buffalo looks at the storm and says, I'm going to get wet. But if I run in that direction, I'll be wet for a lot less time. So the buffalo understands what they're about to go through. I think for me, that word makes more sense than, you know, like, or at least for me, than like embracing it.
Embracing
you know? It's
the
like
pain.
the buffalo's running and like, yeah, I'm getting wet. I feel like that's a,
Yeah,
maybe that's a
I
cool
definitely
buffalo.
100% get what you mean.
Well, why does-
That's why I like using the word embracing.
Right.
It already has a positive connotation to it. Like embrace discomfort. Come,
Oh,
bring it at me. Let's go.
100%.
Like, yeah.
Because why does pain have to be negative?
Because it's sore.
Is it though?
Why is that bad?
But why is that bad?
You're hectic, guy. Higher level thinking.
Now, tapping in.
Totally.
Can I add something to
Absolutely,
that,
please.
So, something you mentioned ties in with that, because you said, I'm doing this willingly, right? Like, all the suffering you're going through, like, you said you were going to start a business, you did it, you knew this was part of it, so, like, you're doing it willingly. So there's definitely something for, like, deciding that I am going to do this, and I know that I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to, like, attack it head on. Where that's, like, very interesting to me, like, in humans, is that humans are both predator and prey, or we come from, like, you know, back when we were existing in nature, we were both predators and prey. So in our brains, there's two different kinds of circuitry. There's a prey circuitry and a predator circuitry. So if you're going towards something, you're engaging the predator part of your brain, not the
prey.
like scared
Yeah.
prey.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of labeling things such as pain as like good or bad, positive or negative, like it comes from this idea of attachment, and this also kind of like is very related to this idea of where suffering comes from, is this attachment and desire, right? So there's this quote by Naval Ravikant. Who knows who Naval is?
So say that again.
Naval Ravikant. Okay, so he's basically, if you guys think of like Silicon Valley venture capital, he's like that man incarnate. Like, he was one of the guys who first started like the big angel investment funds, right? At this point, he's just like a very successful billionaire venture capitalist guy, right? So he spent his time just being a philosopher now, because he's pretty much won the money game. Now he's trying to figure out the life game, right? So he has this quote that desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want,
Yeah.
right?
Can you say that again? But it's you
Yeah,
holding
you
yourself
definitely
accountable.
Say it again.
Can you say it again?
Desire is a contract that you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want.
Yeah.
Right.
Until I get
That's
there.
true.
And this is the idea that when you desire something, like you don't want anything that you already have, right? Like if I have this hoodie, I don't want this hoodie because I already have it, right? I can enjoy it, I can like it, I can respect it, but I don't want it because I have it. You only want things that you lack. So you can kind of get rid of that deficit in two ways. Number one, you could just get the thing that you want, and now you're just kind of bringing those two together. Or you could just remove the desire, and now you don't feel the lack, right? So it's kind of this idea that a lot of times, especially when it comes to outcomes and expectations of results and the labels we put on them, like positive or negative, or pain is good, pain is bad, whatever, right? We associate expectations to them, right? And when things don't go our way, we feel more resistance to it because we've already set an expectation for it, right? And that causes suffering, right? So a really, really like tactical thing that I found to kind of get yourself out of that loop is understanding that everything is just a vehicle for your growth. No matter what. So if something goes well, doesn't matter. What did I learn? How did I grow? If something goes poorly, doesn't matter. What did I learn? How did I grow? Right? No matter what the situation is, you're always improving and getting better and finding all the lessons in it, right? Because if you're stuck on expecting a certain outcome or having like, this is a good thing that happens, this is a bad thing that happens, either one of those, you're unable to find the lessons in that situation, regardless of what that is, right? Because if you're successful at something, you probably won't look back and be like, okay, what did I learn from it? Because you've worked, you assume you're perfect, right? But if it's a bad outcome or the less desirable one, you also don't usually look for the lessons because you're just upset at it, or yourself, or other circumstances, and you start playing this anger blame game, right? And it's basically like trying to play Where's Waldo, but you're colorblind. It doesn't work, right? Like maybe you might stumble across a cool lesson now and again, but how do you know which one's Waldo and who's that other guy that like looks like Waldo but is blue? You know, like it's the same thing but different colors. So when you start looking at things as how can I actually learn and grow from this, this becomes an incredible superpower because now you're grateful for suffering. You actually become grateful for the pain that you experience because you know you're going to learn a better lesson from it, right? And this allows you, like where other people will see upsets, you see setups. It completely flips it on its head. And this now becomes like an incredible superpower for always growing. Because you're always advancing in that way, right? You're never just satisfied, you're never comfortable. You're also never going the other direction because you're being depressed and sad and about pain and suffering and things like that. You're always advancing, right? Does that kind of make sense to everyone so far?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Go into the storm.
Go into the storm, exactly, right? Because you know that's going to be the minimization of suffering.
And don't
Even
be
though the pain
defeated
is
by failure, because that's what you learn. That's where you learn, is through failure.
Like before you go into the storm, let go of the desire of staying dry.
Yeah,
That's a big one. That's a good statement.
Because you know that you're not going to do that
You're not
anyway.
gonna.
Yeah. That's crazy.
It's
I
also,
hear you. Loud and clear.
I guess it also comes back to like the base rewards are the ones that you suffer through. So like when you go, like when you gym, no one likes gym. Like, and it's not like when you first gym, like you have the six pack. Like you suffer through that, and then after that you like feel great. It's like same when you see a girl that you like. I mean, if she just comes to you like. But if you work for her, then you're like, okay, no, like you appreciate it more. Yeah.
100%, 100%. And one more thing I'll say about like the going into the storm, right? The cattle also like they started running before the storm even came, right? So they started suffering before the pain even arrived.
Yeah.
Because like when you're worrying about something, you actually let that thing make you suffer twice.
Yeah.
Because you're suffering on your own, just self-inflicted before you even have the outcome that you're worried about. And it just keeps compounding and making it more and more miserable for you, basically.
Yeah.
Right? And that's exactly a great point that you were making about the biggest rewards come from the greatest of suffering, right? Because that is where you find a lot of meaning from the suffering, right? And that's kind of like the last thing that we'll talk about in this section is like, when you suffer for something, it changes the game entirely, right? And having just a perspective of why you're doing this, whether that be for your own personal growth or someone else or achieving a certain goal, whatever, it really changes the game. So there's another quote. I feel like we've had like 2 quotes already, so this is number 3 for you guys. This one's from Seneca. No man is more unhappy than he who does not face adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself, right? So imagine how unfulfilled you would be if all you did was just be comfortable knowing that you could do more, but you won't, because doing more would risk discomfort.
Yeah.
How unsatisfied would your life be?
You never got to prove yourself.
You never had the chance even, right? And the beauty of life is that we have the choice to prove ourselves every day. We have the choice to embrace suffering. We have the choice to, I'm going to use embrace like realistically here, because that's what it really means. It's like, look at it in a positive light, and now it becomes a positive thing. Because the pain, you know you're getting better from it. It's no longer suffering to you because you know how to detach from it. You know this is what's going to lead you forward, and you know that embracing it's going to minimize it. So there's less suffering, right? And there's only growth from that scenario, right? So that's kind of what I'll finish up here with is, when I'm sure you guys have always kind of heard the phrase, like, you know, when, like, find something you're willing to die for and then live for it, right? But what does that mean? Like, what does that mean to live for something? What do you guys think?
Like, just to like track back to like what you started off saying, like I have this theme that I'm trying to explore as an artist, like visually, right? And it basically interrogates identity and like certain struggles attached to certain identities. And so it's like assuming a certain identity comes with certain struggles, and then it's something you just kind of face once you've assumed identity. And so it's like, how do you have like the foresight for what those struggles are going to be before assuming the identity, or like what else do you use to construct your own identity? And then so in like living for something, it's essentially like the quest or the exploration of different identities or different ideas about who you are, to essentially like dial down or like tally the demons you know, and just like deal with those demons that you know, until you outgrow them, and then you meet the boss, and it's like Metal Slug. The next level comes with the next boss, right?
Totally.
Yeah, so it's like living for it is then just like going for it all the time.
Going for it all the time.
With that identity in mind, like knowing that like, okay, because I want to be this type of person, it means I have to go through certain things to actually be that type of person.
That's well said, for sure. Anyone else have any ideas for like what it means to actually live for something?
I think to live for something for me has always meant, you know, outside of the things you need to do to physically wake up and live, that thing you live for becomes your number one priority.
Priorities.
Outside of eating,
No matter
sleeping,
what, yeah.
and whatever you're doing, the next thing on the list is what you chose to live for. That's how I've always seen it.
Interesting. That's actually very well put. That's a good perspective.
There's a lot of pressure in that, right? Because the way we live today, all of those other basic things are normally sorted. Like, you are going to sleep, you are going to get fed, and there's a lot of pressure to like figure out what that thing is you're living for, right?
That's a good point, because if you come at it from kind of that idea of like, what do I have to live for? It has to be something meaningful, whatever. Like, oh, what is he doing? But I think that what it means to live for something is to suffer for it. It is to suffer well for it. To be able to do that with a certain level of skill, because that's going to make you the person and align yourself with the identity that you want to be, and also give yourself the best fighting chance to make the impacts you want to make, or you can make, right? So living for something and suffering well for it, you can use that as a compass for what you should be doing, right? So using your pain as a compass, almost, right? Because whatever is going to be the most uncomfortable thing for you is probably where you're going to grow the most, right? So using that as kind of a compass of like, okay, what should I do if you don't know what to do? what am I most uncomfortable doing? What am I most afraid of? What like excites me and scares me the most?
That's probably what you have to do.
Yeah,
Probably
what's
what
the
you have to
biggest
do.
roadblock?
And the reason it excites you and scares you, though it excites you because it's a big deal for you, right? There's something inside of you, that intuitive impulse to go do the thing, but it's going to scare you because you know there's going to be a lot of pain and trial and tribulation along the way. It's not comfortable. You have to actively seek that discomfort and embrace the suffering along the way to get there, right? So that using that as your compass can add a lot of clarity to who you want to be as your identity, and then make it your priority to kind of live for that thing, right? So in simple terms, find something you're willing to die for, then live for it by suffering well for it, right? Don't just suffer for the sake of suffering, but suffer well for it. Look for the lessons, get out of your comfort zone, and grow with those things. Look for the lessons for it and embrace the change. Because a fundamentally useful belief that I've had about life is that life happens for me, not to me. So no matter what happens, I always know, hey, this is going to somehow connect, and this is actually going to somehow be in my favor, right? And I have a quick story about this. So a little more, I guess, about my background, me personally. I used to be very much like an academic. I went to UC Berkeley, got degrees in math and physics, was on track to be like a research scientist and everything like that. Very kind of heavy in like that little bubble, right? And all the way through undergrad, your entire like identity and self-value, and also value of how you look at other people within that major, is tied to what grad school you go to, basically. So it's not even about like how well you do in school. It's like what are you going to get into graduate school afterwards, right? It's always kind of like this externally expansive thing where you're no longer like always the next thing, always the next thing, right? And a lot of your value is intrinsically derived from that, or your perceived value, right? It's kind of really weird now that I'm looking back at it. But so my last year of college, everyone's applying to grad schools, everyone's getting into grad schools, and I think that time I applied to 9 or 10, right? So a pretty good amount. And all of the rejection letters started coming in, right? And I thought I was a pretty good student. I had a great resume. I had all this research experience. I thought I had it set up to make it at least into one of these good schools. But I got another rejection letter, and I got another rejection letter, and I got another rejection letter, right? So it got to the point where I had this thing that was so ingrained to my self-worth and my identity from 4 years ago, and now it's just falling flat on its face, even though I've done everything I was told I had to do to get there, right? So during this time, I remember I just gotten, I think, rejection from Stanford. So I was like pretty sad about it. I went on a hike, I went on a walk, and the only thing I could tell myself during that walk is like, I don't know how this is going to be a good thing for me. I don't know what this means, but I have to trust that this is going to be a good thing. This is going to lead me to where I need to be. This is actually going to course correct maybe, or shift my life in some way that's actually going to end up in a net positive for the impacts that I need to make, right? That was the only thing I just kept repeating in my head as I was taking that hike. And I think that was really kind of a pretty big flashpoint for me in terms of like not going to grad school at that time led me to take a gap year, which led me to explore like other things like entrepreneurship, business, sales, and things like that, which fundamentally, through a lot of twists and turns, led me here. I would not be here if I had gotten into grad school 4 or 5 years ago. You're welcome. Thank you, Stanford. Round of applause for Stanford.
Stanford.
So
Thank
the
you,
dots
Stanford.
will always connect looking backwards, right? But you just have to trust they're going to connect moving forwards. And that is a big, big leap of faith, to trust that life happens to you and not for you.
No,
Other way
it
around.
happens for
Take
you.
going back. Life happens for you, not to you. Exactly. That's the right one. So you just kind of have to trust that as we go forward. So hopefully with these ideas that I've shared with you, some things that maybe shifted, maybe changed in your mind about how to approach suffering and pain, and especially as we go through this weekend, you're going to end up with a lot of situations that are uncomfortable. You're going to have a lot of pain that's there. But you can choose to either be a cattle and run away from it and suffer a lot because you're not getting out of it. Storm's always coming. Or you can choose to be a buffalo. Face it head on. Know why you're doing it. Do it in service of something. Grow from it, look for the lessons in it, and you'll suffer a lot less. And I promise you, like, if you prioritize that, you will be more fulfilled than any level of comfort could ever bring you. Does anyone have any final ideas kind of on what that means to you, or like how this is going to relate into this weekend. Come on.
I just have a question.
For
like,
sure.
So when you're like going through the suffering, because like we're humans and we're in communities, or we're always attached to people, like how do you manage the people and yourself within that? Like
How do you manage relationships?
yeah,
and-
in that sense, like
While you're suffering. same
while you're
time.
suffering, yeah. Because
So,
like
like, when-
sometimes committing to the idea means sacrifices, and the sacrifices mean time
Mhm.
and like that lack of other connections.
It's always going to come at a sacrifice, but I think it just comes down to what you're willing to sacrifice and what you want that to be of, right? So it's like you can either sacrifice time, relationships, sometimes money, and all those, like comfort, or you can sacrifice your dreams. It's your choice, right? So it really does come down to sacrifice, but sacrifice is not in itself an inherently negative thing, right? It is just a neutral thing that you can use as a tool to maximize and reallocate energy and resources to something that matters more, right? So it's really just, yeah, the pain of suffering or the pain of regret, right? That's kind of how I would manage it, because if a lot of times dealing with different people, different types of relationships, people will either like understand and support you or not, right? So sometimes you do have to be pretty brutal about cutting those kind of relationships out, just in terms of a allocation of your finite energy. Where are you going to allocate that in order to make the highest impact? How can you use that to make the highest leverage moves in your life?
But also be sure to properly communicate that. That the other person understands why you do whatever. If someone doesn't respect your time and you cut them out, that's
They weren't meant
they're
to
not
be
your time.
anyways.
But if you do communicate and you're like, listen, for the next 3 months I have this thing coming up, I'm working towards this, please bear with me. I'm not gonna come out, I'm not
Yeah.
gonna do whatever, but give me this time. Afterwards we'll go again, we'll party again, we'll do whatever again. But communication is key.
And I think ideally, like, people kind of struggle with that because they don't want to like cut people out, or it's like, oh, but I still can do this. Like, yeah, sure, it's possible, but I would encourage you all to kind of really think of the urgency of life. And we have a finite amount of time here, and it's fucking short, right? So come at life, attack the storm with a sense of urgency, because the faster you get through that storm, the faster you're going to get to who you need to be.
So, to like add to that, yeah, specifically on the thing, like the faster you face it, the faster you get on the other side. It's like, yeah, now I'm dealing with the suffering thing. Let's face it head on, because if I'm just gonna run the other way, if I'm gonna be the cattle, you know, how much time I'm not gonna waste by just lingering and sitting there in that suffering state. Whereas if you were actually to face it head on, you know, and get over it quickly, or get over it and just face it quickly, then you'll actually have more time, not only to, you know, take
Exactly.
on the next goal, but to attend to other relationships,
Exactly.
other things.
A lot of times, this idea of comfort that you think you're sacrificing in order to like attack suffering head on, people think you're sacrificing comfort, but it's really just this illusion of it, right? Because like the cattle are not comfortable by avoiding the storm. They're running. They're expending effort and energy and focus. They don't have time to think about anything else. Their sole mission is avoiding the pain, but it's going to come anyway, and it's going to come for longer.
I think another thing, going back to the sacrifice, is that, you know, the cattle and the buffalo were in the same place because there was grass to eat. The buffalo sacrificed where they were to go through the storm to find greener grass
I
that
love
had
that.
been rained on.
Love that.
Cattle keeps running and
That's
the grass
so
is
cool.
dry where it's
Yeah.
going, you know?
It's dry where they're going. By avoiding suffering, you go to drier grass. That's so cool, because that's an insight I did not have. Like that is an insight that I on that story, because I've heard that story a few times, and when people tell it, like they tell it a certain way, and it's like, oh, like avoid suffering or like minimize suffering. But you know, you kind of add to that, and like, oh well, if the cattle are running away from it, they're actually suffering before it even comes. So there's layers to it, but that's an incredibly deep layer to it. I love that. You got to give up the good for the great.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. Thank you for that.
So like for me, now the reason for like the real reason behind, not behind, explanation for living for the thing is like what you were saying about like the sacrifice, the everyday, because living's an everyday thing. Right? So the things you do every day, like not speaking to these kind of people, not that's a way of shaping your life, because the reasoning behind you taking those actions is always the thing. I'm doing this because I'm trying to get to the thing. So you now deciding to wake up at 5 a.m. every day, you deciding, okay, I'm not going to eat a certain type of food because it's going to affect me. You get me? Like those small steps every day is what living for the thing is for me.
Do you guys know the root of decide? Like the root of that word? Like the Greek root of it?
Decide.
Decide is like decadere, which means like to cut away. It's the same thing with like
Oh, shit.
incision, incision, it's a cut, right? Like
It doesn't mean...
herbicide, anything with like that is like to like kill or to cut
kill,
off.
to cut
It's like
away.
to kill and to cut away, right?
To cut away the other option.
Decide, right? So fundamentally, when you're deciding something, you're not just choosing something, you're actually cutting away everything else.
That's a
really
crazy
what
way
it
to look
means.
at it. That's the inverse.
And this
of
comes
that.
back to this idea of sacrifice. Like you have to decide to wake up at 5 a.m., which means you have to cut out staying up till 2.
Yeah.
It means you have to cut out these toxic people that are just going to party all night, right? So you have to cut things away in order to decide. You have to make sacrifices in order to decide the life that you want. And this is all part of this skill of suffering, is learning how to make decisions that will advance your goal and your purpose and your highest being in a way that like serves your purpose, right? So it's like that's part of the skill, is learning how to decide and sacrifice as part of the skill of embracing and suffering well. Learning how to suffer so you suffer less.
Fucking great.
I appreciate you guys all for also participating. I think it added a lot to the conversation as well, so thank you.